Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. My guest today is Associate Professor Ted McCormick. Ted is a specialist in intellectual history and the history of science at Concordia University in Canada. He examines the intersections between science, technology, economy and empire in the early modern era. Recently he's taken an interest in how the concept of the Enlightenment has been taken up as something of an ideological cause by some popular writers. In particular, he's critiqued the way the Enlightenment has been portrayed by Steven Pinker in his books The Better Angels of Our Nature, and particularly his more recent work, Enlightenment Now, which Pinker has subtitled The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress. As a historian of the Enlightenment, Ted has serious problems with the way Pinker, a non-historian, characterizes the Enlightenment as a historical phenomenon and the rhetorical purposes to which he puts his version of its history. So please enjoy my conversation with Ted McCormick about the Enlightenment, Steven Pinker, and new atheist uses of history. So Ted McCormick, thank you very much for joining me all the way from Montreal, and thank you for joining us here on History for Atheists. We want to talk about the Enlightenment, and in particular, we want to talk about Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. And I've seen on Twitter that you've been having great fun critiquing Pinker, which I think is something that needs to be done. But I suppose I need to admit, first of all, that I haven't actually read Enlightenment Now. I have read his earlier book that preceded it, which is The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I thought was pretty terrible. And I'm getting the impression from reading what you and other critics of Enlightenment Now have said that his grasp of history hasn't improved. So maybe we can get onto that in some detail. But I think I should say the reason I haven't read his book is that, as we were just sort of saying before we started the recording, I'm not an early modernist. I'm very much a medievalist. And so while people have asked me, what do you think of Enlightenment Now? My problem has been I don't have the background to really be able to give it the kind of criticism that I would like to. Whereas you do, Ted. So that's our conversation today. But before we begin, maybe we could sort of just talk about what are we talking about when we're talking about the Enlightenment? And then maybe we can talk about what Steven Pinker thinks he's talking about when he's talking about the Enlightenment. But if you had to define it in an elevator speech to someone, how would you do so?
I'd have a very tough time doing so, because one of the sort of characteristic features of Enlightenment historiography is a debate over the definition of the term. And there are, several sort of, I guess, families of interpretation of what the Enlightenment is. And one big kind of division within those is whether it even makes sense to speak of one Enlightenment at all, or whether there are multiple Enlightenments. And one of the reasons for this is that, well, on the one hand, a lot of discussions of the Enlightenment focus on ideas. There's a very kind of fairly thin type of intellectual history which focuses on great texts produced by great authors in the 18th century and the ideas in those texts and sort of logic of those ideas. The more historiography came to focus on the context in which those ideas were articulated, and the particular people putting them forward, and the specific arguments that they were addressing, the specific events they were concerned with, the processes they were involved with, the more local contexts or national contexts seem to be relevant. So that the French Enlightenment looks very different than the English Enlightenment, and that both of them look very different from what was going on in German-speaking lands or in Russia. Yeah. So there's, depending on political context, among other things, political and social context, the Enlightenment can look very, very different. And so for some people, Enlightenment history is just the intellectual history of the 18th century. Or the intellectual history of a certain canon of great 18th century thinkers, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, people like that. Or if you're looking in England, Locke, Newton, people like that, and they're sort of their self-conscious followers over the ensuing century or so. But if you're concerned with social history or cultural history, then the Enlightenment looks very different, and often it's not so much a matter of great figures and their great books, as of things like new forms of public association, things like coffeehouse culture, news culture, new kinds of print, the rise of novels, that new art forms, that sort of stuff. So and those often, both the freedom to produce those things and the manner in which they were produced and the context and the audiences for which they were meant varied quite a bit from one place to another, and their sort of overall significance and their relationship to this, the sort of standard set of great ideas of the Enlightenment, of older historiography like secularism or freedom or democracy or whatever it might be. Those, in some places, those relationships simply don't obtain. So it's very hard to kind of talk about the Enlightenment as a whole, encompassing everything that one or another Enlightenment historian might mean by it in any kind of cohesive way.
Gotcha. I mean, the interesting thing is, in preparation for our conversation, I went back and had a look at people like Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great, at Sam Harris's stuff, at Dawkins, and to see if any of them actually gave a definition of this thing they call the Enlightenment, and none of them do. They refer to the Enlightenment in capital letters, and they're constantly talking about it being this wonderful thing that is kind of the pinnacle of our of human understanding and thinking, and how it must be protected at all costs, and how religion is the great threat to it, amongst other things. There are others, superstition and anti-progressive forces, and certainly more recently, some of those figures have started to see so-called woke culture, a word I hate, but as one of those, and I think we can get back onto that when we're talking about Pinker.
Sure.
But they never define it. So they never actually talk about what this thing is. It's kind of an amorphous grab bag of science, the scientific revolution, democracy, free thought, skepticism. It's kind of this thing, but they never actually define what it is. Does Pinker bother? Because the others don't.
He does, although his to the extent that he gives a definition, it betrays some of the same ambiguities and some even sort of greater ones than what I've just indicated. So he talks about it. He does talk about it as an 18th century phenomenon, as a historical thing, historical process or event. But at the same time, and sometimes almost in the same breath, he defines it in terms of these four things that are in his subtitle. So reason, science, humanism, and progress, I think, are the four.
Yeah.
And at one point in the book, it's in the first chapter, I think, he sort of says, the Enlightenment is interesting because that's when these ideas took shape. But on the other hand, elsewhere in the book, these ideas are timeless. And so it's both a historical event and a timeless set of ideas. And one of the things that happens both in the book and more especially in his responses to criticisms of the book, criticisms from historians especially, is he'll sort of say, well, look, I'm just using Enlightenment here as a rubric. This is a term he's used, I think, more than once. This is just a rubric for these ideas. And I could have called it secular humanism. I could have called it, it's at various points, it's identified with, I think, classical liberalism. So it just is a sort of floating signifier that kind of means whatever Steven Pinker happens to want to defend at any given time. And because it kind of can be detached at will from the specific historical context, which he at various points thinks is important, there's really no ground on which to kind of base a criticism that he has to answer. Because if you say, look, you're getting the Enlightenment wrong, he'll just say, well, yeah, but I wasn't ever talking about the Enlightenment. So in one of his defenses of his book, I think it was the more recent one published in Quillette, so in 2019, he says, people who are criticizing me for not getting the Enlightenment, they're missing the point. When I say Enlightenment, I'm not talking about 18th century people. I'm talking about Enlightenment as it's commonly used now. And I think he I don't know if he quotes or he just refers to speeches by Barack Obama and Emmanuel Macron, where it's applying reason and science to enhancing human welfare or something like that. And I mean, at that point, there's no, it's like nailing jelly to the wall, right? There's no real substance to what he's asserting that you can kind of pin him down on and say, okay, well, if we're talking about this, here are my problems with this, because what this is just shifts with the wind. And that's been very much his strategy in defending, Enlightenment now. And it's been a strategy that's been picked up on in some ways by his other defenders.
Your point there about the fact that he's kind of divorcing it a bit from the history, but he keeps trying to use history, and this is something that I found particularly irritating about Better Angels. Dawkins, very not long after the book was Better Angels was released, said, sneered on Twitter, why did this book need to be written by a scientist? Implying that historians weren't up to the task.
Well,
And the answer was basically because historians know what the fuck they're doing, and Pinkett doesn't. Better Angels is one of the worst pieces of supposedly historically based argument I've ever seen, because he just cherry picks whatever he can find to prop up a caricature of history. His stuff on the Middle Ages is just hilariously bad.
Well, yeah.
But, no, I mean, so is it that bad in Enlightenment Now? How does he use history, and what are your major critiques of it?
Okay, so taking it as history. I mean, well, let me preface that by saying, as much as he denies that he's making historical claims, he is obviously making historical claims.
Yeah.
At some points in the book, he says these ideas, first took shape in this period, so that's why this period is interesting. He sometimes claims he's translating 18th century ideas into 21st century language, and he'll have, I think, early on in the book, he has a quotation from Kant where he sort of gives Kant, and then he quotes someone that he likes from Now, and says they're saying the same thing. So there's definitely a claim to historical interpretation there. There's a claim that these events meant a certain thing, and even in the least historical part of the book, in a sense, the least historically grounded part of the book, where it's just graphs and this is progress. I mean, the whole point of that is to show change over time. I mean, that's a fundamentally historical kind of claim. So as much as he wants to sort of walk away from, he doesn't want to be on the hook for historical accuracy, he is making an avowedly historical argument. But he's doing it in a way that he avoids having to give any kind of causal explanations. And I mean, so just to get back to saying, so it is a history. It's not just a discussion of ideas. It's got a historical argument, though he sometimes denies that. As a history, taking it in that spirit, there are a lot of problems with the claims made about the Enlightenment, the picture given of the Enlightenment. It's a very partial one. It's, the sources that he favors are cherry-picked, and they're often interpreted in sort of questionable ways. And there are several reviews that historians wrote. I think in particular, Peter Harrison for ABC wrote a very good one, a pretty early one too. David Bell in The Nation, and Jessica Riskin, who's another historian of the Enlightenment, in the LA Review of Books. They all kind of picked apart the partiality and the kind of cherry-picked or tendentiously selective nature of his history of the Enlightenment. They pointed out that although he identifies the Enlightenment with reason and sees people who are critical of reason, which he never defines, of course, but people who are critical of reason are therefore by definition being unreasonable. Critiquing reason was literally one of the major occupations of the sort of classic canon of Enlightenment thinkers. So, he kind of very seriously misrepresents even the very thin kind of intellectual history that he's sort of engaging with. To say nothing of all this sort of wider stuff about context and sort of social setting of Enlightenment and the kind of infrastructure which supported it. Which he's not interested in the least, but which is a big part of Enlightenment historiography. That's all entirely missing. But I'd say setting that aside, because that kind of edges into criticizing him for not writing the book that someone else would have written. I do think the cherry picking is an issue, the selectivity is an issue, the failure to define reason is an issue, both in the historical part of the book and in the polemical part of the book, part 3. But there are also sort of basic problems with the structure of the argument. So kind of big picture is that the Enlightenment gave rise to this set of 4 great ideas: science, reason, humanism, progress. And in the wake of the Enlightenment, in part 2 of the book, as we have all the graphs showing us, things got better. Things in all sorts of measurable ways got better. And so the Enlightenment is the cause of this, or Enlightenment is the cause of this. And that's where the ambiguity of, are we talking about ideas here, or are we talking about events? It's not really clear. That ambiguity means that the claim is sort of meaningless unless you can anchor it in one, one sense of enlightenment or another. Then it's not even clear what you're saying, except that things got better and enlightenment had happened before that. So there's no causal mechanism. And I think it's Peter Harrison in his review who basically said, parts 2 and 3 are effectively just non sequiturs, because you have this, cartoon of the Enlightenment, and then you have graphs, and then you have part 3 where we learn that, academics hate progress. And that's it. So there's no tracing of how you get from, even taking his account of Enlightenment as, let's say it's correct. Let's say, that in the 18th century, these 4 big ideas came to be or were articulated in some importantly new way. We still have no line that gets us from that to the changes shown in the graphs in part 2.
Yeah.
Instead, we just have an assertion that ideas cause change. And I forget exactly how he puts it, but he says that ideas really do, they really do change things. And then he goes into talking about, this is a fact about the brain. So I guess we're supposed to infer that people were exposed to these ideas and their brains changed, and that's why people have longer life expectancy now, or they have better medicine.
So it does sound like there's a bit of a classic post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, but I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit with you, Ted. I mean, while I think he plays fast and loose with the data, he certainly, some of the data he used in Better Angels wasn't data at all. It was just gibberish. Some of the sources that he used were highly dubious. He also took things like casualty numbers given in ancient and medieval sources as though they were statistical facts, which is just hilariously stupid. But playing devil's advocate, lots of people say to me when I talk about the idea of the Whig fallacy, the Whig version of history, that basically history is this onward and upward progression in progress and civilization. They say, well, we do have a longer lifespan than someone who lived in the 15th century. We do have less disease than someone who lived in the 2nd century. Things are better. I mean, we do live longer and better lives. So isn't there a point? Isn't there some kind of kernel of truth to the idea of progress? And therefore, couldn't you say that things happened in the 18th century that led us there? I'm playing devil's advocate. Well, what would you say in response?
Well, I mean, I think that you've moved the goalpost a little bit there from a causal assertion about the Enlightenment to a didn't progress happen. And I mean, assuming that his data are correct, which, as people have pointed out, is actually a large assumption in many cases. But in any case, letting that slide, sure, they show change, but this is where it becomes important to look at accounts of what has caused these specific changes. And one of the things that's frustrating about this book and this kind of genre of argument, I think, often sort of people doing history without historians or without looking at historians, without reading what's already been done, is that you get the sense that nobody has thought about this before. There's never been any attempt to discuss changes in the 19th to 20th centuries before it, occurred to Steven Pinker to look at the Enlightenment or to look at some graphs. And I mean, one of the effects of doing what he does by saying, well, ideas cause change. These were good ideas. Here's some good stuff that happened after. And so we have our story there, is that it completely erases all the causal relationships that historians have studied, that have been written about. Democracy didn't happen because of ideas. It happened because of movements, right? The civil rights happened because of movements. They happened because of collective movements, and collective movements led by people who were not happy about the way things were, who did not think that things were as good as they could be or going to get better automatically. And I mean, the sort of irony of this is, on the one hand, it kind of ignores well-established historical explanations that we already have that are much tighter in nature and much better evidence, God knows, than his assertion that ideas cause changes in the brain, and that's what we need to know about
which is pretty, yeah, which is, as you say, is a pretty vague and therefore tenuous linchpin.
Yeah, but the other
that his argument depends on.
Yeah, so I mean, it creates this very weird sort of vacuous kind of history where cause just happens in this very in the brain, and none of the actual ways in which that get assuming that's right, that still doesn't explain how people's changed brains actually produce visible social and political change. That's missing. And sort of in the historical part of the book, that's a huge problem. But in the polemical part of the book, it actually does a lot of work for him, because the people that he attacks now as anti-Enlightenment are, it's a wide swath of people. It includes, I think he identifies, the populist right as one target. He identifies intellectuals and the academic left as his much more favored target in terms of, the amount of space that he gives to attacking them. But I mean, these are people who are not happy with the status quo, who are critical of the status quo, who think that effort is needed to change things. And so these become, the very kind of people who produced the changes that he wants to credit to the Enlightenment are now demonized as being anti-Enlightenment because they're not happy. And I mean, or because they're not optimistic, or because they think that things need to change, and that needs to happen through, collective action, not through reading Better Angels or whatever.
So that was okay in the 1770s and the 1790s, but it's not okay now because you're now upsetting me as a privileged old white man.
Well, the graph shows it's not necessary, right? Because the line is already going in the right direction. So that's a good thing.
So, so we're agitating for the wrong reason. Look, it's interesting that what you were saying there about him ignoring the real sort of social and economic drivers, cultural drivers. It's just sort of this abstract. And I find this a lot with a lot of these sort of New Age thinkers. They seem to think that these ideas happen in some kind of vacuum, and then through some kind of magic, they have an effect on the world. I think a classic example is slavery. The emancipation movement was not driven by people sitting around in salons in Paris or people in coffee houses in London. It was driven by Christians, which is really awkward for these guys. And Tom Holland and I were talking about this in my conversation with him a couple of months ago, and he really makes this point quite strongly in his book Dominion, where the idea that the Enlightenment led to the end of slavery completely ignores the fact that the people out there on the ground doing the work weren't intellectuals and were largely not driven by reading Voltaire. They were driven largely by reading the Bible, which just doesn't fit with what Pinker says. So what are your thoughts about Pinker's vision of how the Enlightenment possibly magically led to the end of slavery, and what do you think actually happened historically?
Well, I guess, I mean, there's 2 points to make that I would make. I should preface all this by saying that, the fundamental observation that his account, his kind of, idealistic account of historical change ignores actual social movements, sort of concrete agency embodied in particular people, groups of people, often mostly non-elite people. I mean, that's a point David Bell makes really well in his review. So I can claim no credit for that insight myself. Yeah. But I'll say, look, if you're talking about abolition as a European movement, as something that is something that white people in Europe took up, then that's a major problem with this kind of picture of a neatly secular Enlightenment, because it is, often it's motivated by religiously inspired people. I mean, the Quakers play a huge role in this. Yep. And so, that doesn't fit at all with the idea that Enlightenment did this. I mean, it's also worth pointing out that Enlightenment didn't do it anyway, even chronologically. I mean, the slave trade wasn't abolished until into the 19th century. Slavery itself wasn't abolished until the 1830s, in the British Empire. Britain. So, the chronology, I mean, I guess you can say, well, it happened afterwards and people were pushing for it. So, okay. But I mean, the larger point here is that, the people doing the work on the ground were also the enslaved. And it's very hard to make the case that they were inspired by Voltaire. They were probably inspired by the fact that they were enslaved. So I think that was probably the key motivator there. And there's a long, history of slave revolts and resistance. And there's also, a fairly long history of religiously, justified or articulated criticism of slavery. There's a lot of different kind of pieces in the mix here, and a lot of different groups of people in the mix. And that's something that really gets just sort of drops from this account entirely. If it just becomes a matter of, well, who was the first person to write a really good book that argued this in philosophical terms we still accept today? I mean, that's not, you can ask that, and you may get an enlightened author as your answer, but that's a very different question from how did slavery actually end? Right? How did abolition actually become necessary, or become, inevitable, or become, how did it happen? And, that again is, you can skip a lot of complexity if you're just looking for a kind of clear, quotable articulation of the position that you now believe in. But explaining historical change is something, quite a bit more complicated. And in the case of slavery, you can't do it as you were saying, right? This didn't happen in salons.
No.
So
yeah, and the people in the salons would be sitting around saying, yes, slavery is a terrible thing, or not, because some Enlightenment thinkers didn't think it was necessarily a terrible thing. But then they would then go upstairs, and the servants downstairs would be doing the washing up. So it's not like they were really practicing what they were preaching a hell of a lot, whereas the Quakers were. So it's kind of, I just see this real sort of disjunction between what people like Pinker are claiming happened in history and what happens on the ground. I think that point that you've made is a good one. The other one that I find interesting with these guys is they don't seem to have any kind of grasp of the importance of economics in history. And I've often said, quoting my medieval history lecturer many years ago, if you don't understand economics, you don't understand history. So he used to always preface in his lectures anything to do with economics with, yes, I know this is boring, but unless you understand it, you're not going to get what was going on. Right. And that really hit home with me. I was listening to a podcast the other day critiquing Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs and Steel, which I read when it came out and thought was really interesting and actually quite persuasive. I've since changed my mind. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons I've changed my mind is that he doesn't pay any attention at all to economics. Why were people going to the New World? It wasn't to just for their health and for a holiday. They were going to plunder the bloody place. And that enormous driver that doesn't get looked at all. Does Pinker look at economics as a driver? Is it all ideas? Is it all abstract for him?
In this sort of, so part one is the more historical part of the book. No, it's really, it is about ideas. And I mean, he does say, I guess political economy pops in here and there. I mean, for example, at one point, I think he says that, that the Enlightenment saw the first rational analysis of wealth or something like that. And, I think the story there is more the work that Rational is doing, because it's really not clear what on earth that would mean, than any kind of claim about economy. But yeah, I mean, this is where, his engagement with a very, very kind of thin intellectual history. It's kind of ironic that I'm accusing him of doing a very traditional, like, text-based intellectual history, because he's actually not that concerned with the text either. But he is sort of tying these ideas to certain big names in a very old-fashioned way.
Yeah, great man history.
Yeah, where the social basis on which these great men rest, the sources of their wealth, the reason they're able to have leisure, the reason they're able to have salons, the reason they're able to have sugar and coffee and all the rest of it, that's not part of the story. And that's where I think a failure, well, put it in a more positive way, had he bothered to engage with a lot of the last 50 years of historiography on the Enlightenment, he might have been able to give a more interesting, certainly a more three-dimensional account of what was going on. But you would not, he would then not be able to escape talking about things like empire, talking about things like trade. You can't. It's very weird to me to discuss abolition as an idea and never mention, why it was necessary, and that, the Enlightenment coincides with the height of the slave trade, and the height of the slave trade in these, most enlightened countries. So, but if you deal with the social and economic and imperial context in which all of these thinkers existed, you can't avoid that.
Yeah. And it sort of strikes me that it's sounding very much from what you're saying, and thank you for saving me the effort of reading the book. It's like a lot of these guys who start with their conclusion, and they have a polemical boat to row, and so then they go and find ways, cherry picking history to prop that up. There was a book that I've written a review of on the History for Atheists site by Nathan Blackstone, which is basically making this critique of the new atheist use of history generally. He calls them hunter-gatherers. He says what they do is they start with the polemical end, and then they go and hunt and gather through history or a version of history to find anything that props it up, and pay no attention to anything that doesn't, pay no attention to context, and pay very little to no attention to, as you say, actual historiographical scholarship, historiography generally. So another example is one we call Catherine Nixie, who wrote a book called The Darkening Age, which was a absolute throwback to Gibbon, which basically said Greeks and Romans, rational and wonderful, everything marvelous, beautiful temples, look at their art. Christianity came along, destroyed it, Dark Ages. And it's one of the most regressive pieces of she's a journalist, not a historian. But in order to do it, she has to tell half the story the whole time.
Right.
So she tells the story of the destruction of this temple, the Serapeum, and in her version, Christians just turn up and tear the temple down because it's got a library in it and they hate learning. What she doesn't tell you is the reason they turned up is that there was a gang of pagan terrorists holed up in the temple who were going out and kidnapping Christians and crucifying them. Doesn't mention that. And I find that these guys do this all the time. It's this cherry picking. We keep using that term.
Yeah.
Can we get back to your point though about his polemical use of the pseudo history? Because I'm really interested in your points there about how the skeptics that he held up in the 18th and 19th century as being 18th century as being good. Suddenly, anyone who is against the status quo now is bad. That seems like an interesting paradox.
Yeah, well, he has this remarkable sentence. Where is it? It's something about if you opposing reason. This is from page 351. I wrote it down because it did strike me. Opposing reason is by definition unreasonable. I wonder if he would go along with, opposing Antifa is by definition fascist. It works the same way. So, once you've announced that the Enlightenment is reason and you haven't said anything more, then, anyone who thinks, well, there are limits to reason, or there are areas where particular types of reason are, can be dangerous if not checked by, concern for values or whatever it might be. Then you've kind of said, anyone with a problem with this is anti-reason, is anti-enlightenment. And I mean, the sort of overall response that he's had to his critics is to just say, well, they're anti-enlightenment, so what do you expect? And that this is rooted in, a kind of slippery, very vague definition of enlightenment, and tethering it to these four also very vague ideas, science, reason, progress, humanism.
Yeah.
So that's how that works. I mean, another sort of curious feature of his history that feeds into his polemic too is there's a real asymmetry in what needs to be explained. So the whole point of the book is that, we have these good things that we have now because of the Enlightenment. So Enlightenment caused them. They need to be explained, right? Progress needs an explanation. It has to be, at least notionally, it needs a historical explanation. Anything bad, and he lists at various points, racism, slavery, genocide, and autocracy, I think is another one, or despotism. These, he says, were ubiquitous in pre-modern history. Racism is natural, right? This is rooted, and this is where he kind of retreats into the brain, as it were, the same way he does with the force of ideas. So they don't need any explanation, right? If you see a genocide, well, that's just nature. That's how people are. And if you see a genocide happening before Enlightenment, well, that's to be expected because Enlightenment hadn't happened yet. If you see it happening after Enlightenment, well, you can't blame the Enlightenment for that, right? You should thank the Enlightenment that there weren't more genocides. So, because those things don't need explanation, right? All the bad stuff is natural. And so it has there's no question mark to place around it. And so this is another way of ignoring historical accounts, or not just ignoring, but kind of actively dismissing historical accounts that look at the role of particular figures or particular ideas or particular structures or processes that connect the Enlightenment to bad things. And this is where he goes off on his attacks on academics and readers of critical theory or Marxists or whatever the label is, for being anti-Enlightenment, because they buy into these things. But we all know really that genocide is just the norm, racism is just the norm, slavery is ubiquitous in pre-modern history. So it's really unfair to try and pin that on the Enlightenment. And at one point he even says, I think this is not in the book, I think it's in his defense of himself, one of his defenses of himself in Colette. He says something like, it makes no sense. It's actually a post hoc, right? Charging people with post hoc by saying, look, it's true that there were new articulations of racism and imperialism and so forth in the later 19th century. But to blame that on the Enlightenment, you can't just blame everything that happened after the Enlightenment on the Enlightenment. But he's just written a whole book crediting everything good that happened after the Enlightenment to the Enlightenment. So why the hell not? I mean, if that's how we're arguing, then you absolutely can do that.
Yeah. See, that's really interesting, because I just wanted to home in on that point, on the fact that you can play that game both ways. So if you look at some of the justifications of genocide, I grew up in Tasmania, and you read and I've studied the history of the Black War and the virtual extermination of the Tasmanian Aboriginal, certainly wiping out of Tasmanian Aboriginal culture. And it was justified using the kinds of language that was used in the salons of the 18th century. It was all this stuff about, they are a primitive people and they were probably dying out anyway. Look, they only had rocks and sticks and stuff as technology. We have all this other technology, therefore it's purely justified. And that is all 18th century philosophy writ large. So he can't play it both ways, can he?
Well, I mean, you would think not, but it's amazing what you can do if you don't bother to read anything. I mean, and this is a feature of treating these things as if they've never been examined, as if there are no accounts. And I mean, on the one hand, I think that's just simply ignoring existing scholarship is one way to go about it. Another way to go about it, and he does a little bit of both of these things, is to say, well, because, as I've already said, racism and genocide are just the norm, of course, people are going to find, in any given period, people are going to try and justify them. And so there's nothing special about the particular justifications that anyone offers. And that even includes when these justifications also happen to be central arguments of the Enlightenment figures. Yeah. So somehow these arguments matter and are important when they're put to, positive, progressive uses, and they cease to matter. They're no longer of any historical interest when they're used to justify genocides or expropriation or conquest or whatever. Yeah. And I mean, it gets back to that point about it's just a very asymmetrical way of approaching history.
Because it's interesting that the justifications for genocide in Tasmania were pre-Darwinian. This is in the 1820s and 1830s. So Darwinian evolution hadn't come along. They were purely based on a kind of a Hobbesian view, but they're also based on a almost like a Linnaean classification, which was a very Enlightenment idea, the idea that you can put everything into categories and hierarchies and classify everything. And it was, we are here on the hierarchy and they are here, so it's okay for us to exterminate them. What else would you say are things that you could argue bad things that came out of some of these Enlightenment ideas?
I mean, I have to say, when I teach the Enlightenment, I tend to sort of take, I guess you call it a kitchen sink approach. So, I mean, I do present students with, arguments about, positive things, or it's not necessarily so evaluative as that, but these are ways in which Enlightenment ideas, visibly shape political movements, or Enlightenment ideals are invoked in defense of this or that, political change, and it could be something we consider positive or not. These are ways in which stage theories, continued to shape the nascent social sciences. I think, one thing that you just touched on in your example that I would say, perversely enough, kind of helps explain Pinker, is this idea that you can do history without doing history, right? That you can kind of establish a natural way that things develop. And this is something, it's identified in Adam Smith with the idea of conjectural history, which is a history and yet it's not a history, right? No actual historical case needs to follow exactly the steps of development that are laid out in the sort of ideal, typical conjectural history of how things happen. And yet somehow this ideal, typical thing is almost more natural than the way things did in fact transpire. And I think, I'm not going to say, oh, well, Pinker obviously, read Dugald Stewart's Life of Adam Smith, and that's why he wrote a terrible book. I don't think that's the case. I doubt that he's read it. But I do think that this idea of there being a kind of way of just reasoning your way to an account of the past, without needing to kind of touch the ground at any point. I do think in some ways you I don't know if I want to say it. That's the Enlightenment is why we do that. But I do think that's one thing that's present in Enlightenment stage theory, is a kind of evacuation of history.
Yeah.
And a teleology too, right? Which very much does structure Pinker's and many other accounts of this.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of thinking, for sure.
And that kind of thinking actually permeates a lot of, if I can refer to sort of, the new atheist movement, or kind of the thinking that I come across among atheists online, is they've got this kind of abstract idea of the past, and they don't need to actually found that on any kind of evidence. It's just like, well, this is what it is. And if you hit them with counter examples, they then just get confused and then usually just yell at you or block you. And that's exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, welcome to Twitter. But that's exactly what you're talking about. This idea that history is just this thing that you can kind of know,
right,
through some kind of abstraction, rather than, as you and I know from having slogged through evidence and sources and the historiography of a particular question. It is nothing like that. Your point about him not engaging with the fact that he's not the first person who's come up with this. Do you think he actually did any kind of reading of the history at all, even just to cherry pick, or has he really just sort of decided to do it all on his own?
Oh, well, I don't think he did any serious reading of any, or of very many, I guess I should hedge a bit, scholarly works. He does cite he cites works by historians, but most often they're kind of works that were written for a wide audience. They're popular surveys. They're not, journal articles. If he cites a journal article from something other than a science field, it's probably because he wants to make fun of it. He does this with historians of science. Well, he does this with what he calls science studies, right? He has this. There's a paper about icebergs this is like his go-to example of what the ridiculous things that feminists and historians.
Oh, I know the paper you're referring to. Yeah, it's the one they always use. Yeah.
No, so that's in the book. It's also, I think he did an interview or a piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education where he also brings that up. That's his example of how bad it's gotten in history of science. So he doesn't really do the legwork of reading scholarly monographs on the Enlightenment. He cites, I think, Lynn Hunt's book, Inventing Human Rights. He cites David Wootton on the history of science, but I think it's The Invention of Science that he cites. And there's just sort of a few other, broadly speaking, popular trade book historical narratives of Enlightenment that he mentions.
Yeah.
And occasionally there's a specific citation, but he's awfully loose about that. And I mean, some of the time, I don't know if he's even read these or if this is a research assistant supplying references or what. What I can tell you though, I'm pretty sure that a research assistant will take the blame for some of the more creative quotations that appear, at least in the polemical part of the book. And I mean, it should be said that it's in academic terms, it's extraordinarily sloppy work.
Yeah, I've seen some of the examples that you've highlighted on Twitter of that, where he's been pretty creative in crafting what looks like a quote but actually isn't, which is another kind of alarm bell for me when it comes for a bad book. And the stuff that you were just sort of talking about, how he kind of gestures towards real scholarship, but on the whole leans on trade books by non-specialists. Again, this is absolutely typical of these guys. It's absolutely typical of people like Hitchens and Dawkins and so on. They aren't interested in history, really. They're interested in their argument. They have there's no curiosity about what actually happened. Can I work out what happened first, which is what you and I do, and then extrapolate from that. They start with the end point, and as I've said before, kind of work their way back, which is why this stuff is so bad and frustrating. Frustrating for people like us.
I mean, it's also just sort of it's kind of. I mean, I don't know if in this particular case this makes sense, but I mean, in general, I think it's a missed opportunity because these are. I mean, it would be hard to deny that the Enlightenment has had massive historical significance. I think wider public discussion of it is a good thing. It's also a very interesting historical phenomenon, very complex, an awful lot of interesting things going on. And, one would like to think that a public intellectual writing a book on Enlightenment that's going to have millions of readers would exploit that interest, would exploit that complexity to, do something towards educating the public. But instead you get, the thinnest, most dull, as well as being inaccurate account of this very complex thing. And it does, I think, on his part, betray a real lack of curiosity because, I mean, his interest isn't historical at all. And I guess what's unusual at Pinker is that he's frank about that. When pressed, he will say, look, I don't care about the 18th century. That's not the point. And that's sort of refreshing. I don't know. It's different.
It's certainly honest.
Yeah. But his defenders won't let that go because I think, more frankly than he does at sometimes, I think they see that, there's a particular historical narrative here that is being posited as absolutely essential to maintaining, the status quo in the present, which we think is good because we think it's trending in the right direction. And so anything that threatens that is absolutely to be dismissed. And it's, unfortunately, that's most of professional history because you can't really look at the sources and look at the historiography and look at the period in any depth and come away with an account that looks like this.
Gotcha. A couple of final questions then, Ted. First one is slightly facetious, but if Steven Pinker was one of your students and you had to give his book a grade out of 100 for its history, what do you think you would be giving young Steven?
Oh Lord, I mean, there is no history there.
Zero?
Well, let me put it this way: if we think that historical claims need to be substantiated, and if we think that terms need to be defined, it does neither of those things. So, yeah,
he fails. Yes. He fails. All right. Okay. Bad luck, young Steven. And given that I do like to help my listeners and the readers of my blog to understand history better, if you were to recommend some works that people could read that would give them a good understanding or a beginning of an understanding of what we're talking about with the Enlightenment, is there anything that springs to mind?
Oh, well, I think, because it's such a big topic, there are a few different ways to go on something like this. I mean, if you want a big picture kind of overview of the Enlightenment, there aren't a whole ton of recent ones that I think are necessarily going to get into the complexities as much as, you know, a history teacher or professor might like.
Yes.
The one that I tend to use in my classes is Dorinda Utrum's The Enlightenment, which is a textbook, and it's a bit textbooky, but it's short, and it does have a nice range of different chapters that it covers. If you're looking for, you know, a very positive assessment of the Enlightenment that will probably be congenial to some of the audience that Pinker might be trying to attract, but, you know, people who care a little bit about the history. Margaret Jacobs' Secular Enlightenment is, you know, it has a very, well, as this title suggests, you know, a view of the Enlightenment as a secularizing moment, but she knows the period, you know, very, very well. She knows sources inside and out. It's very readable. It's very accessible. But I think for my part, I tend to prefer to get into these big complex periods through much more specific studies.
Yeah.
So, you know, a particular subject, a particular topic, a biography. One of the more recent biographies I read was it wasn't published in the last few years, but it's relatively recent. Is Judith Zinser's life of Emily du Châtelet. That's a good one. It's in Penguin. It's, you know, very affordable, very accessible, but you get a sense of both the individuals, a little bit about the networks, the role of institutions, some of the scientific debates that were going on, but through the axis of one person. So you kind of, it's, you know, it's nicely grounded that way. So I'd say, you know, come into it through something like that. I'd also say, I mean, Jessica Riskin's work, she wrote the LA Review of Books review of Pinker that I mentioned earlier. Yeah. I think she's does a lot of really, really good work, and so I just sort of blanket recommend looking at some of her stuff as a sort of, particularly for those interested in history of science.
Yeah, and I read her critique, and several of the other ones that you've mentioned as well. It was good stuff. What I will do, Ted, is we'll make sure that we put some references to those books and also to some of those articles in the description of this episode.
Sure, I could come up with a more sort of structured reading list if there's 4 or 5.
I'll put you on the spot there, mate. Yeah. It's like when people ask me, you know, what's one book I should read on the Middle Ages? It's like, good luck. Mate, it's 1,000 years of history. Which bit?
Yeah, no, same here.
I realised it was a difficult question. Possibly an even more difficult question, Ted. We have got a bit of a tradition here on History for Atheists of inviting our guests to sing. Now you can decline, but you may. That's fair enough. But it began when Seb Falk mentioned that he was a sailor and he liked sea shanties. So he then sang a sea shanty for us. Tom Hollands and I were talking about his love of 1980s British new romantic pop groups. So he sang a bit of Vienna by Ultravox. I didn't invite Tony Christie to sing because he's a fan of the Grateful Dead, and I didn't want to inflict that on anyone.
Oh, see, yeah.
Love you, Tony. But
I think
you can decline, Ted.
Yeah, I'm gonna plead the Tony exception, I think.
Fair enough.
2 traditions.
That's fine. Yeah, you take the other path. That's okay. Ted, do appreciate you taking the time and thank you very much. I think that's a great encapsulation. And as I said, you've saved us all the effort of reading what is a very, very long book. There are much better books to read. So I will take you up on the offer of a reading list. We'll get that from you. And maybe if Pinker brings out another book, we might get you back.
Okay. I'll have to read it first, though. All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
No problem. Ted McCormick, thank you very much.